Hello, my name is Penny Bryden, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the fourth and middle day of the CHA Conference 2021. As a settler who resides in the traditional territory of the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Lekwungen peoples, and who has not left this corner of Turtle Island for the last 16 months, I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to connect virtually with people across the world and across historical moments and perspectives. That was made possible by many over many years. The program coordinators and their teams, Alan McCallum in 2020 and Shannon Stundenbauer and James Muir in 2021, solicited papers, put together panels, and planned social events. Their work laid the foundation for this conference, even if it was not what they were imagining. And I know everyone in attendance joins me in thanking them. The decision to host a standalone virtual conference would not have been possible without the work of many, but in particular, thanks to Michel Duquette for his willingness to manage everything from behind the scenes, and to those assistants, Brandy Goddard, David Hazen, Sam Hossack, and Gary Myers, who work every day behind the curtain. I'd also like to thank all of the presenters for joining us in this unfamiliar territory, for amiably agreeing to a virtual format, for making the best of Zoom, for making do on a platform that doesn't allow you to talk to your friends or see your audience and read the room, and most of all, for sharing your work with us. And I'd like to thank all the people in the audience, both for being here, but also for taking this work forward, for adding Indigenous authors to your syllabi, for revising your perspectives, for referencing and recommending new scholars, and for all you will do in the coming weeks and months to amplify the work that you have heard here. I'll turn it over to our first panel now and wish everyone a wonderful day of conferencing, and I'll see you in the audience.
Unmute. Kwenkanawa Loma, Ninta Shinzi Julie, Nino Giai, Nalali, Shuknawikian Windsor, Niwin Lotaman Wendak Takwa. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Tucker. I'm from Munsee. I live in Windsor, and I follow the ways of the turtle. Thank you for everyone attending. It looks like we have about 27 people attending today. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here so we can have these beautiful images. Yeah, and you can see everyone in the corner there. So while we meet here virtually, I would like to acknowledge the importance of the lands and waters with which we call home. I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm physically situated on the territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi. Please join me in a reflection to acknowledge the land and people have been continually subjugated by settler colonialism, and to take a moment to think of the 215 children who were found on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We would like to know where all of you are from, so please name where you're coming from on the chat. So this panel today was initially to be held last year in collaboration with Tom Peace, and our group actually planned to have a canoe trip from London to the reserve and to host some of the participants in CHA at our community center, which is pictured here. So unfortunately, that wasn't able to happen. So hopefully it could happen in the future. But yeah, so that's how this sort of panel came about, and that's the history of it. Sorry, I missed over. Skip over. I just like to note this is my backyard, and this is a corn that I've been growing. It's Smith calico corn from Six Nations seeds, and this is a good year for it. So just to talk a little bit about our group, we are a group of Munsee-Delaware Nation band members who are interested in the culture, language, and history of the Munsee-Delaware people. Our group is also interested in includes people from the local area, including elementary and university educators. We are curious about our past and have been involved in studying and sharing family and band history for our entire lives, and more formally for the past 5 years. During this time, the group has come together to study and celebrate the lives and histories of the Munsee-Delaware Nation people and community. Our aim is to pull all our available resources to safeguard the community's linguistic and cultural heritage and to support and sustain Indigenous leadership in researching and teaching about Munsee people, communities, and language in ways that reaffirm relationships to the land, environment, and other people to support Indigenous self-determination. So all of the wonderful people today on this panel are members of that group. So I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we're going to have 3 presentations, roughly 20 to 30 minutes each. And the first presentation is by Chief Peters. And Chief Peters is a graduate of the University of Western in philosophy and law. He's a member of the Law Society of Ontario. Peters has researched our history for over 30 years, and his work includes building a land claim for Munsee since the beginning of the pandemic. Kikai Peters has also taught Munsee history in over 50 online lectures on his Facebook and YouTube platform. So you can always find him on Facebook and online or YouTube. Mary Jane Logan McCallum, the history professor, not the senator, is a professor at the University of Winnipeg and a Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous People Histories and Archives. Karen Mosko is a Munsee language keeper who's been teaching classes in the Lenape language in Ontario, New York, and New Jersey for many years. Ian McCallum is an Indigenous educator, PhD student at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. And my name is Julie Tucker. I'll be the chair today and try to keep everyone on time. I'm an artist culture worker based in Windsor, Ontario. Yeah, so I think that's everything. So first we'll have a presentation by Chief Peters, Munsee-Delaware History, Nation History on the Thames. And then Mary Jane will go second, speaking about Mount Elgin and the work that the children did there. And third will be Ian and Karen speaking about the language.
Yeah, well, Anishik, Julie, for your introduction to myself and all of us here this morning. I'd just like to say Kwingane Waloma and Pinjikyo. Welcome to Nalahi, the Munsee-Delaware Nation. Ndishinzi Kike Mark Peters. My name is Chief Mark Peters, and I am the chief here at the Munsee-Delaware Nation. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk about our history, although it's a very long history. As mentioned, I've gone through some 50 sessions, about 50 hours so far, and I'm only at the year 1763. So we could be here for a long time, but I'm gonna just give a brief outline of who we are and where we came from and where we are now and where we're going. So just like to mention, as Julie did as well, you know, the tragic revelation that has come to light over the past few days, and it's become what I think is a national tragedy. I've seen traveling throughout the province actually in the last, on Monday, that flags were lowered everywhere I went. So it's good to see and supportive and comforting in a way to see the solidarity of everybody in the province that I've seen, and probably across Canada as well, as we deal with these revelations and have to consider whether there are more to come. We've got a fire going in our community as of 2:15 yesterday afternoon, and a memorial tonight for everyone in the Southwest area to come together and find some condolence and healing, and not just First Nations people, but anyone who would like to attend. So I just want to say that there will be more to be said about this, I think, from other panelists. But the Munsee-Delaware Nation here is here on the Thames River, just about 30 miles west of the city of London. And you can see this map of the Thames River in front of you. This is the first survey of the Thames River. which was completed between 1790 and 1795. And it shows our location on the Thames River. If we go to the next slide, perhaps we can get a closer look. This is 3 separate Delaware villages located here on the Thames River, with the Chippewa of the Thames village located just north of us. And we moved here around 1782 at the end of the American Revolution. We were allies with the British Crown during that time, and because of Britain's not winning that war, we were all forced into this area, similar to the way loyalists were as well, and located here on the Thames River in 3 separate villages, coming from New York and even in Ohio to get to these locations. Before that, however, and if we can go to the next slide, the next one after that, yeah, we were located in this area in the northeast coast of America, as it is now, in eastern Pennsylvania, northern New Jersey, and southern New York. And you can see the lightly shaded area on the top is the area where Munsee-speaking people originally come from. And below that, in the darker shaded areas, where the Unami and Unalaktago people came from, and collectively we were known as the Turtle, the Turkey, and the Munsees were the Wolf people. And we made up what's known as the Lene Lenape, and now known as the Delaware Indians today. But it just shows on this map where we originally came from. And we were pushed west over a century or so from the Hudson and Manhattan areas. And Manhattan is a Munsee word, meaning where a certain wood grows to make bows for hunting. But due to various land frauds and pressure from significant settlement, pushed us west, mainly over to the Delaware River for a period of time. There were a number of massacres that happened in the mid-1600s as well, and disease took away a significant amount of our population. Actually, about 90% of our people were lost by the year 1700, a population of some 20,000 or more to about 1,500 people in the year 1700. And today we have 160 people living here in this community and about 600 members in total. So we've suffered a lot of devastation during this time period. And afterwards, we continued to be pushed further west and ended up on the Susquehanna River, as you'll see on the far left there, and into the Allegheny and Ohio rivers. We were known as peacemakers for a large period of this, well, for all this period of time, really. We didn't take war out on anybody, and nobody took war out on us during this time period. And we were known as peacemakers until the 7 Years' War came along, and the French started moving from the west and the English coming from the east. We were caught in the middle on the Susquehanna River, like a pair of scissors, as is discussed by a man named Paconcha to a missionary named John Heckewelder in around 1780, kind of a metaphor for us being caught between these two countries as they came together. And we had no choice but to take one side or the other, or be cut in half like a pair of scissors. And it's an interesting metaphor that applies not only to this war, but also the American Revolution, when we were caught between the Americans and the British at that time as well. But at the beginning of this war, we took our frustrations out on the colonial governments that had taken our lands, but eventually made peace through a man named T.D. Uskung, a Delaware Indian, who helped us to negotiate peace with the English, and resulting in a treaty at the town of Easton in 1758, and us then siding with the English from that point on until today even. there's records from people that spoke here in the 1840s about us assisting the British in throwing the French on their backs and in scaling the walls of Quebec. And when I first read these, I didn't really know what they meant. But if you think about the last battle at Quebec during the 7 Years' War, the soldiers had to scale these cliffs to get to the Plains of Abraham. And when they talk about scaling the walls of Quebec, that's exactly what they mean. And we joined with the Six Nations in that particular battle. Unfortunately, the rest of this few decades involves war, and we were involved in Pontiac's War after that, and then Lord Dunmore's War, and then the American Revolution, which came along, and people think that had to do something with tea and taxes, but the real reason for the American Revolution was to be able to continue to take our lands. Britain had proclaimed in 1763 the Royal Proclamation, which protected the lands west of the Ohio River as Indian lands. But the colonial governments in America didn't like that because it stopped them from taking our lands. And that's basically why this war happened. And obviously our land was taken because of that. We can go to the next slide. This is just an example of a fishing weir that a friend of mine was able to get to me. That's located on the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, New York border area. And this weir has to be hundreds, if not even thousands of years old. It's a rock formation in which the fish would swim into this V and be able to be speared or caught at the end of the V. And I'm just showing this as an example somewhat of this continuing evidence of our occupation in these areas. So we can go to the next slide now. During the American Revolution, like I say, we sided with the British. We fought with a corps known as Butler's Rangers. And we obtained this wampum belt from the British government as symbolizing our alliance with them. And it has the initials GT on the end, which stand for King George III. And it's on display at the Museum of Natural History in New York City at the present time, and on very conspicuous display, and many people see it on a daily basis. But this man is Jacob Dolson, and he is very much related to Karen Mosko, who's one of our panelists here today. And like I say, this belt represents an agreement, a treaty between ourselves and the British government during and near the end of the American Revolution. And due to this alliance and treaty, we moved into Upper Canada and to the area we saw on the map just a little while ago. Now, as we moved into this area on the Thames, there continued to be wars, and they became called the Indian Wars. Although Britain and America had settled on the 49th parallel as the border, First Nations in the Great Lakes area did not agree with that at all and continued to fight the Americans to keep the lands west of the Ohio, resulting in a series of battles, significant battles and wars from 1783 to 1795, ending with the Battle of Fallen Timbers in Michigan. So as we took part in those battles as well, we continued to live on the Thames. And I believe the next map or the next slide, well, this is an example of the belt that Jacob Dolson was holding. This is the display at the Museum of Natural History. We can go to the next slide now. And in February 1793, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe and 7 of his officers, and also Joseph Brant, Ticonderoga, the Mohawk chief, and 7 of his warriors came from the Six Nations down the Thames on their way to Detroit to talk about how to settle these issues in the Indian Wars. this is a kind of a rough map, but it's hand drawn from that time period. It shows the Delaware village there, similar to what the map we saw. And Simcoe and Brant stopped here overnight, and there's a record that they had venison and eggs in the morning. And then also a meeting was held, a council. And at that time, Simcoe reaffirmed our treaty with Britain and our alliance with them during the Revolution, and gave a deed to one of our chiefs for land on the Thames River. And we continued to reside here for many years afterwards. And if we can go to the next slide, it's an example of what I believe is the very belt that Lieutenant Governor Simcoe gave us at this time. It was found in Moravian Town, which are our brothers and sisters, as we call it, Nahi, down the river from us. And these letters on this belt, I believe, stand for Lieutenant John Graves Simcoe, and two figures holding hands in alliance. So it's just another confirmation of this treaty and agreement that we had with the British. We go to the next slide now. Like I said, we continued to reside here on the Thames. No one bothered us and everything was fine. And then the War of 1812 came along. And as we know, Tecumseh was one of the First Nation leaders in this, and General Brock was the British leader, but there's also a man named John Norton. He was like the right-hand man of Joseph Brant Tandonega during this period. And he was a major in this army, and he commanded a force that included the Munsees to a significant extent, and some of the Chippewas and Moravians. And we fought with him during the War of 1812. And there's records again from the 1840s of us fighting with him, and also getting promises from General Brock. And in John Norton's journals, he talks about these very things, and that we had also suffered very serious casualties during this war. And further to that, Tecumseh himself based a lot of his understanding of things based on previous Munsee prophets that were located along the Susquehanna River 30 or 40 years before that. And this message to try and keep our ways and be less dependent upon European goods. And this message continued with Tecumseh into the War of 1812. And in fact, Tecumseh as a Shawnee, we can go to the next slide now, I believe. This census from 1830, it's a little hard to see, but there's 5 or 6 families here that identify as Shawnee and Munsee. And as we might know, Tecumseh was Shawnee, but there's a reference by a missionary named Peter Jones, Kake Wakwanabe, the Mississauga missionary, that this man named Captain Jem Snake, who identifies as Munsee and Shawnee here, was the nephew of Tecumseh. So it shows our close relationship with the Shawnees at this time. And in fact, we were noted to be located at the bottom of Lake Michigan in the 1680s by La Salle, the French explorer. And at that time invited the Shawnees to come back to the area of Minisink on the Delaware River with us. And 700 or 800 of them did so, all of them actually. And we continued to be pushed back west together after that, and we've had these close relationships ever since. So we again fought and allied with the British, continued to ally with the British further in the War of 1812. But around 1820, things started to change quite a bit. A lot of the relationships we had with some of these frontier diplomats and other officers they were passing away or moving out of the area, and colonial government officials were moving in. And all of a sudden this relationship, this alliance we'd had for some 60 to 70 years previous to that became forgotten. And when the lands began to get purchased in this area, we were left out of these land deals, and our treaty agreement with Simcoe, those wampum belts representing that, were all disregarded. However, one day after the first sale of land in this area, we came right to the Indian agent and complained that what's going on here. So we didn't just wait around. We, like they say, this is a day after this first agreement for land sale occurred that we weren't able to be involved in. And it resulted in a number of petitions from about 1826 to 1909, 23 of them that we have at this time. And they're actually the basis that got me started on this history, because they talk about, like I said, throwing the French on their back, scaling the walls of Quebec, riding with this man that wore a green coat. And what that meant, I had no idea until I realized Butler's Rangers wore green coats. And the things kind of started to be put together, like what these guys were saying is all true, that Simcoe came through here and made this agreement. And sure enough, there's a record that he did. And so it really was quite interesting to see how this oral tradition was able to continue and to be quite accurate for a number of years afterwards. We, because we were left out of these land deals, we didn't have any, what you call an annuity from the government, as other nations in the area did. And we had to find and continue to make our own way. So we continued to farm as we had been since we moved here in the 1780s. And from a few hundred acres, we managed to be farming some 2,600 acres by the 1880s. And, you know, we weren't just wanting to be farmers either. We had our own school here in 1820. We employed a man named John Carey. And there were 16 students in this school. It might even be the first school in Upper Canada. I'm not sure, but it's surely one of the first. And in 1849, the local First Nations decided to get together with the government and create what's called the Mount Elgin School. We're going to hear more about that from our other panelists, but it was kind of a joint venture at first to realize that, you know, we wanted to learn industrial skills, what you'd call trades today, farming and making implements and all that, but also reading and writing and other educational opportunities. And we've been pursuing these even for 100 years before this. But eventually, when Canada became Canada in 1867, things changed quite a bit. And instead of trying to work together in these areas, all of a sudden these laws decided that we were a problem and we had to be gotten rid of in some way. And that way was to assimilate us into the rest of society. And the real problem was land, really. We were a problem for people to continue to steal our land. And that was the real basis for a lot of this, I believe. However, we continued to be who we were and have our languages, although through the residential school system, as we're going to hear, things were tried to be taken away from us. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to say this is what's called the remnants of our big house that existed here until the 1830s. It's a building, and ceremonies were held here at least once, if not 4 times a year, depending on the season. But there was a large ceremony that lasted 12 days here called the Big House, or Xingwikan. And it was an opportunity for everyone to come together and talk about their dreams and visions and their experiences over the past year, and to give thanks to Quechalimokwang, the creator, for providing us with everything that we needed to have a good life. And we had an obligation to thank Quechalimokwang for this, what was given to us, and also an obligation because Quechalimokwang was a kind and charitable creator. We had an obligation to be kind and charitable to each other and other people as well. So if we go to the next slide, that's just a brief outline of that. There's a lot more to it. This is a picture of a cemetery here in Munsee in the 1830s. an example of the graves and the care we took with respect to our deceased people. And you'll see the holes on the ends of these grave markers that are meant to allow the spirit to come and go over the few days after one passes away. But we can go to the next slide now. And as we continue to farm and do what other things we needed, we also continued to be involved in sports activities. And lacrosse was one of those. This painting is a lacrosse game from way back in the 1600s, I believe. But the article next to it is about a lacrosse game between a team known as the Wabanakis and the Torontos. And Wabanakis is a word we use to describe ourselves, the Munsees, as the people of the rising sun. And it's interesting that we continued to call ourselves this. And this was our lacrosse team here from Munsee, and it gives the names of a number of players here. And all of us pretty well here are related to these players. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll see a picture of a man named Nellis Timothy. And he was the captain of this lacrosse team. And the written article beside him there talks about him being received by royalty in England a number of times. And that part of his mission was to try and get funding to build a school at Lower Munsee. So it just goes to show again how much we wanted to, continue to practice our traditional ways. I mean, look at what he's wearing, but also to be able to learn the ways of the other society and in reading and writing. And he made serious efforts to, again, make it so we could do this without having the government do it for us. And this is just actually a photograph of Nellis Timothy from that time period. And like I say, he was the captain of this lacrosse team. The picture on the right is a picture of Nelson Peters, related to some of our other members. I'm not sure myself related to him, but this uniform he's wearing, and I thought it was the First World War, but it's actually, I'm pretty sure before that, it might be like the Boer War in Africa or something like that. It's a very unusual uniform. But we can go to the next slide now. And this is a continuation of the petitions we'd been making to government since our lands were not secured to us. And similar to what Nellis Timothy went to see the Queen about. But this is about a man named Scobie Logan, who is related to, again, a couple of our panelists here. And he, with a man named William Half Moon, and there's a cemetery here called the Half Moon Cemetery, made a trip to England to see Queen Victoria about our treaty and the promise of lands. And William Half Moon died on the way, and I believe is buried in Philadelphia by the Quakers. But Scobie Logan continued on his journey, and there's an article written in this English Standard newspaper, yes, in June of 1882, about Scobie Logan coming to England. It's a very long article. And again, it goes over to the same history that all these other petitions have been stating for the previous 40 years or more. And so he went to England, and I'm not sure if he got to see the Queen, but he did bring a tomahawk with him, which we can see on the next slide. And this tomahawk is in a museum in London. A gentleman was able to come across this and went out of his way to contact me and let me know about it and to take pictures of it so we could have this for our records as the tomahawk that Scobie Logan took to give to Queen Victoria. And it's stated in the article, I believe, that the handle actually still had blood on it from the maybe War of 1812 or the American Revolution, and they had to put a new handle on it to make it more presentable. But there's a picture of a half moon and well, there's an engraving of a half moon and stars on this particular tomahawk. So I find that quite interesting. And we can go maybe to the next slide. I've just got written down here that, well, actually, we'll stay back on that tomahawk, I guess, but this is for the next presentation. But there's not going to be any more pictures that I have, but during this time, like I say, we continued to farm, and we did quite well in our farming, and we began to join these competitions at municipal and county fairs and such. And we did quite well, actually, to the point of winning prizes quite regularly. But because of that, it was decided by these fair boards that, I don't know if the word fair really applies here, but these fairs, that we were too much competition. And so they created what's called an Indian category. So we wouldn't be able to compete against non-Indians, and we could only compete against ourselves, a very racist type of policy that they created to keep us from being successful in a way. It's an example of the continuing racism that we've been facing for many years. But, like I say, at the same time, residential schools were in place, and we're going to hear more about language and culture and traditions. We're all very much oppressed. And then mechanized farming came into being around the 1940s and really had a major impact on our economies, in the sense that we weren't able to afford these large industrial type of farming equipment. We couldn't use our land for collateral to buy them, or to get loans to get them. And we were squeezed right out of the farming industry to a large extent because of that, and resulting in, with these residential schools and other assimilation laws, of us becoming much more dependent on the government, and things like alcoholism became a serious problem after these times. It doesn't seem to have been a serious problem before then. So these resulted more in breakup of our communities, family breakup, and individuals. And because of this, the 60s scoop came into place and began to take our children from our families and place them with non-native families because of this destruction from the ways we've been treated. 1969, the white paper came into place by the Trudeau government as a way to just hammer the nail and the final nail in the coffin of our assimilation. However, the First Nations did not take that lightly, and full force was taken to respond to that, resulting in our entrenchment of existing rights in the Constitution in 1982. And today we're now talking about inherent rights, which is even wider than these existing rights. And the government is now starting to say, okay, yeah, we're sorry, but we are beginning to see that you were organized governments and societies before we decided to take over from you, and are now trying to give us these opportunities back. So we've taken advantage of that in the last 40 or 50 years. We've seen a lot of infrastructure, housing, roads, sewers, water, and such, and taking over on programs and services, education, employment, administration, and all these other things that we have today, like any other town that you might see. We're also getting back to understanding and learning our own history and own culture and traditions and language, as we're going to see in the further presentations this morning. So that's about it for today for me. There's a lot more, but I'm not going to be able to get into that today, and I can't wait to hear from our panelists coming up. So I'm just going to say thank you, Anishik, and we'll continue on.
And thank you, Mark. So I was in a panel earlier at the CHA on our long line of historians. And when I was preparing for that, I was thinking about Mark and how the way that he studies and teaches history has impacted us. So ever since Ian and I were kids, our mom told us to listen to Mark and read his stuff. And he's, you know, a real leader, and he's really understands the past. And so we were always taught to have a special kind of respect for Mark. And I think that that's kind of influenced in some ways, you know, our interest in history too. But in the lectures that he's doing online, he has a way of doing history that I'm trying to learn about how to do and practice as well. He acknowledges people who have taught and researched about this history before, even like in terms of our history, like undergraduate essays, like things that he's picked up along the way. And he's very balanced. And I don't know, Mark, if that's, you know, a training from politics as well. But as you know, our history is mixed, it's complicated, but he has a really careful way of treating people from the past. He treats people as human beings and as complicated. And he acknowledges when there's conflict and inconsistency, right? And he'll slow down there, and you can hear that. But he does it in a way that I think is trying to be kind, and that connects back to that story he was telling about the big house in Kishalimokwang and how to be kind. And so we're thinking about how to be kind in a history way today, and that's kind of especially informing me on this topic. This is a project that we're doing as part of the Munsee-Delaware Language and History Group, which is to study the student labor at Mount Elgin Residential School at a particular time period. And we're doing this work thanks to Julie. Julie Tucker found a grant. This is how we get our projects off the ground. We get some money. This is a grant from the Heritage Canada. It's called the Commemorate Canada program. And so, you know, like people just have these pots of money. This particular pot of money was for a fund for both celebrating Canada on the one hand and commemorating the history and legacy of residential schools on the other. Sort of a weird mix there, but we took the way of the commemorating history and legacy of residential schools. And obviously the topic of residential schools and commemoration and memorials carries particular weight right now. So I've asked Karen Mosko to take a few pictures of the memorial. So the middle picture here is a memorial, and here it is today or yesterday. So we have had this happening across Canada in First Nations communities and in other communities, people coming together to talk about and tell history and tell stories about residential schools, to remember the children. There's another picture that I have here from Karen from yesterday, and I don't know whether you can see it, but you can see people have left shoes at the memorial. That's a memorial that was created a few years ago at Chippewa, the Thames, on the grounds of the Mount Elgin Residential School. And there are kind of plaques in a circle, and the plaques list names of people who were at the school, students who were there. And so all of us here have relatives who are named there and who went to that school. And that's kind of the situation. You've heard from Mark a little bit about also activities happening at our Healing Lodge at Munsee as well. And so these are ongoing things that are happening across Canada right now. So if you could go back, Julie, just for a second. When we got this fund, we narrowed down our questions about how we wanted to commemorate history and legacy of schools. And we decided we wanted to look at 1890 to 1914. Why did we want to do that? Seems kind of specific. Mount Elgin opened, as Mark explained, in the 1840s, and it closed as a residential school in the 1940s, but continued on as a day school until the 1990s, I believe. What we wanted to do was we wanted to create materials for schools, and we chose grades 7 and 8, and the grade 7 and 8 Ontario school curriculum looks at the era 1890 to 1914. So we find like Orange Shirt Day material on the history of residential schools is often tends not to be very specific to place. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of think of an audience that was local to the Mount Elgin area, Thames Valley District School Board, and target a particular, kind of group of people within that area. So that was our thinking for the audience. Why boys and girls work? We felt that it was important to commemorate the work that students did at the school because their work was so vital to the operation of the school itself and to the everyday lives of students who were at the school. So manual labor-based education had significant legacies, including opportunities that the students had when they left the schools. When kids ran away from the schools, lit fires to the buildings, tried to destroy student property, they did so often out of exhaustion and hunger and frustrations like that are related to their working lives at the school, and a sense of injustice around that. Children's overwork was also a major source of parent complaints to the schools. And we have some of those letters with the records of the Department of Indian Affairs. And also labor is just really important to understanding the kind of day-to-day existence of the students in the schools. Okay, so can we go forward to, I guess, yeah. All right. So labor is, and farm labor in particular, is part of everyday life in this area of Ontario at this time anyway. It's a really kind of fertile part of Ontario. It is a farming area, and it's really, at this time, it's pretty connected in terms of communication by rail and roads to other First Nations communities, but also to the cities of London, St. Thomas, Windsor, and Detroit. Mount Elgin is a Methodist school. At this time, it's later run by the United Church after the churches united in early 1920s. At this time, they're starting to get electricity. They have problems with indoor plumbing and water being safe. The school is actively kind of preparing students in the school to work in the surrounding economies, the farming economies around there. So they're training kids to work as farmhands, for boys, and for girls to work as domestics. Also, many went into factory work. Some worked on the railway, some became teachers, like very few servicemen, obviously, for the First World War. And what I'm finding, in order to understand labor history at the school, you need to know how the school was financed. And in part, I went into history because I thought there'd be no math. But the math here is pretty simple. So, you'll hopefully be able to see this a little bit. This is a record from Department of Indian Affairs. It's from the annual report of the school. And basically what happens is that the per capita grant, so the per kid grant from the federal government for running the school is never enough to actually run a school. So I think it's about $60 throughout the period. Maybe they raise it. They ask for more every year. But it basically covers, in this year that I'm looking at, which is 1904, I think, it covers like a quarter of the actual expenses from the school. So the staff is kind of begging for more money. The church gives a little tiny grant. They get a little bit of money from the government to fix up some of the buildings. But like a huge chunk of it is made by selling livestock. And that's a kind of, risky business that the school was involved in for a while. They had to have principals who knew the business pretty well. And because, principal has to do a lot of things at this school, they basically have to be a hotel, they have to be a school, they have to be a farmer, they have to understand the economics of farming at the time. Chances are they're not good, and a reverend, right? So they have to be religious. So the chances are they're not good at everything, and some of them were particularly poor at some things. So what happens when you don't have enough money to run a school, but you're running a school? You need to rely on the labor of the students to keep the school going. And to keep the kids in clothing, to keep the kids in shoes, to keep the kids in bedding and food, that all of that weight of running an institution falls on the shoulders of the kids and the staff. So we kind of thought about our project in the work that happened in Victorian terms. So it is quite segregated by gender. There are things that boys were taught to do and things that girls were taught to do. Those spaces were never, entirely segregated. But boys were thought of as kind of outdoor farm and field work. Girls were sort of indoor domestic kind of labor. And we think of spaces. So the boys' spaces included the barn and the field. The girls, we chose the kitchen and the laundry as spaces of work for them. And what I'm going to do today, just for the rest of the time, is talk about the boys' work. If people are interested in the girls' work, I can talk about that too in questions. So you go to the next one. That's right. Okay, so we've got this map here on the left, and if you could go one more right now, Julie. This is a map of the school in 1896. They just got a new building in 1895, and so from that larger map, you can tell it's quite significant. There's a quote model farm connected to it. This is a mixed farming endeavor. Lots of the farms around this area are mixed farm, meaning that they both raise livestock and they grow crops, and that's supposed to kind of fold together. So the manure from the livestock is used to improve the soil. The land raises the food to feed the livestock and hopefully create some sort of an additional market produce to sell others. And then the stock is sold and later slaughtered for meat. So for example, in 1895, the school produced beef, pork, milk, butter, flour, potatoes, turnips, carrots, and cabbage, as well as oats, hay, and corn. So this type of farm had large barns. One of those barns still exists today. It's still standing at the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. And those are outbuildings for animals, but also to store food like hay and other feed for the animals. They also had parcels of land that were measured in acres. And so in this case, Chippewa of the Thames loaned land to the church for the school to farm. But they also rented land across the river from the Oneida, the Thames First Nation. And that was always sort of a problem. The church didn't like to have to pay the Oneidas for land for the school. And there's actually all kinds of issues around land with the church there. So mixed farming, again, it was risky, but it's also lots of work to run a farm. It's skilled work. It depends on weather. It depends on livestock. If the livestock gets sick, you can lose your profitability. You have to acquire technology and equipment. You have to know and understand the market. And so it really is, especially at this time, kind of a risky endeavor to use, I guess, as a source of protection of children, right? You think that the point here is to look after children. You're depending on a really risky business to do that, and a very tiny grant from the federal government. So also, this area again, the Thames River, right? So it floods every once in a while. So this land needs to be drained in order to become, maximally productive. So that's also part of it, like the tile drainage part of it. And, going into these questions of farming, I realize how little I know about farming, especially 19th century farming. So I go down these little rabbit holes all the time about peas and oats and millet and barley and tile and silage, things that I didn't know about before. But the process of planting and harvesting and threshing and grinding is significant, and it's heavy work. So it's common for children to contribute to the labor of the family farm at the time. But the labor that the students at Mount Elgin were subject to was excessive, even by contemporary accounts, both by the students' parents, but also school inspectors and government officials. So one official noted in 1902 that the care of over 200 cattle, which chiefly devolves on the pupils, entails more work than is good for them. The boys of this school are not only working, but are being worked. And they, as well as their parents, see the difference. Hence the numerous complaints which reach the Department of Ill Treatment of Pupils. Okay, so can you move that forward?
Yeah, Mary Jane, we're just about we're at like 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right, I will. I'll wrap this up. There's a couple of images here on the left. There's the bees. The bees obviously help with the pollination of the plants for the farm. There is quote unquote milkmaids here, girls at the school working, and another photo. All of these photos are done by Scott Studio in St. Thomas. It's a photographer, and are available online. Can you move that one more forward there? So if we talk about the recourse that the students have, I mentioned this earlier, there are various forms of resistance. We're familiar with the term strike. That's what when laborers come together and make demands on workers. Children kind of went on strike as well. They ran away from the school. By themselves or small groups. They would have gone on the rail tracks, through the woods, down the roads. They would go to houses of families nearby, but if they, made it further, sometimes they made it further to other First Nations communities and elsewhere, they'd be brought back by the RCMP, local officers, and then punished for doing so as a deterrent. And other forms are like sabotage, so like wrecking equipment and materials at the school, but also arson. And there's several fires that happened between 1890 and 1915 and before and after. And this is one example of them. So this was a student who, was tired of working, wanted to escape, wanted to get away, and set fire to the barn. And it was a really big story. So it was actually, published across Canada in the newspapers. This was from the Winnipeg Free Press. But he becomes an Indian criminal, after this. So we see this movement of, small amounts of money to run the school, pressure on the students to work, resistance. They get arrested or they get involved, they become quote unquote criminals and there's this cycle of that happens because of this. And I think labor is a really important part of it. And so that's why we're kind of focusing on it. But I'll wrap it up there. Good. Thank you.
Walik Nai Pauni Wamoen, Nida Shinzi Ian, Ninon Jai Nalaki, and Dalangamau Kwa. So my name is Ian McCallum. I have the pleasure of presenting this with my colleague Karen. And between us, we work with the language on Munsee-Delaware. Just a brief context about the language. The language is close to Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. In fact, it's what we refer to as the grandfather language. The Munsee language is the language that Ojibwe came from, and other languages like Cree or Abenaki, or other languages here in the eastern part of North America. It is a distinct language in that it's close. There are some words that are close with others, and there, you can hear the difference, or so you can hear and you can see the similarities. However, it is a very distinct language. It is also spoken in 2 communities in southwestern Ontario. It used to be 3, so Grand River, Munsee, and at Moravian Town. And I'll let my colleague Karen talk about the other 3 points.
Quinganau Lomwa, Nindashinzi Karen, Ninon Gi Nalahi, Nawalotuman Wundak Tukwach. When I first started taking language classes with my mother, the teacher had mentioned that 200 years ago, everybody was fluent in Lenape, and there were less than 10 people that spoke like fluently in English. And it totally turned around so that now everybody's fluent in English, and we have less than 10 fluent Lenape speakers and less than 100 second language speakers. Fluent meaning like first language speakers. So that made the realization that our language is so important to us and to our culture, and we don't want it. We don't accept that the government deems the Lenape language a dead language.
And further to Karen's point, and to the point of other panelists that have made, I think it's been best summed up by Jeanette Armstrong, who did some work back in the 90s and maybe continuing to do work. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to grab a hold of these thin webs that are left behind after the nearly two centuries of devastation wreaked upon by colonial governments. And our work on Munsee pre-pandemic involved making some really explicit connections with the land, history, and culture, because of course language is the one that feeds all three. So with an understanding of the language, you're able to understand the other three. And I look at it this way, that the land doesn't speak English or French. Those are languages that are from not this continent. And that the language actually, where you're at, it's important to learn that language so that you understand that connection with land. However, our research and our program development includes aspects of all three. So, typical activities that we host through our weekly classes and weekend sessions pre-pandemic included, work with planting, beading, basket making. In regards to history, we looked at wampum. We looked at people, much as was already mentioned with Scobia Logan, Nels Timothy, and we also connect with culture. So we invite others who have our songs, some of the people from Oneida who've got our songs to come and share. But we always work that with the language. And again, these programs were delivered through weekly classes that Karen taught on the community, but also extended weekend sessions that many of the panelists here were involved with in terms of providing programming. And the goal is to move towards immersion. So using the language in an everyday context, not just in an isolated context in classes or in those sessions. Next slide, please. So there's a Munsee Mass from the Big House, and I want to say thanks to Michelle Hamilton. I think she's in the audience for providing sort of the information on how to find that. That's in a museum in Scotland, but that's a mask from our community that was part of the Big House ceremony. And then the wampum belt on the right-hand side is a copy that's in the Royal Ontario Museum, but it's a copy of the pen tree from 1682, and that was carried by many community members, and actually was given or was offered to several relatives of the panelists, but it now resides in the ROM.
Okay, so since the pandemic happened, we weren't having in-person classes anymore. So we started at the end of June last year having online classes, and we were having them at least twice a week. And I taught 2 other classes 2 other days a week. So I was doing four classes a week. We also had our virtual gatherings. So the ones that we would do once a quarter in Munsee at the community center, we tried to do online. And it was a virtual history and language weekend. And it wasn't exactly the same, but I mean, we reached out to a lot more people than would have been able to attend in person anyway. So that was very exciting. We've been doing a lot of translations. We had the Bostwick Community Center in London. They were putting greetings up at their entrance of their building. Is that little picture at the bottom there?
Yeah, that's
Ian?
right.
Yeah,
Yep.
and they asked for a Lenape greeting, so that's there. And Anishinaabeg Nation asked for some COVID translations. So I'm not sure if that's on the next slide, but there's different, yeah, on the right-hand side. So there's get the vaccine so that we can sit in the circle again. So they asked us to translate that. And with our language, we don't have a lot of modern words. So we don't have a word for vaccine. We used medicines. So that's what we had to collaborate with each other to figure out how we would translate some of these words that weren't really in, like in our notes or anything that we would have gotten from our teacher. And on the left-hand side is the lost airmen story. Did you want to talk about that a little bit, Ian?
Sure. We were contacted by, I believe his name is John Moses, who's from the Delaware Six Nations, and in his family, there's a poem called "The Missing Airmen." But a couple of years back, John reached out and wanted the poem translated into the language of his people. So we provided the translation into Munsee, and the poem is now on display at the Canadian Museum of History in Hull, Quebec. So it's on display there.
Yeah, so we've also done some translations for CBC and TVO. The interview that we did with the young lady at TVO, her name escapes me right now, but she just won an award for youth writer, I think, for this year. So for that particular translation, she interviewed like 3 or 4 people, and we all translated it into our languages. So that was a really unique interview. We also have like social services centers that are looking for translations, and the daycares. We had the Chippewa, the Thames First Nation daycare wanting some language words from our community, because Chippewa and Munsee are, basically in the same area. And, if you have, sometimes at the Munsee daycare, you have Chippewa children or Oneida children attending. So at the Chippewa daycare, they also have Munsee children and Oneida children attending that. But we're so close. We're related to somebody that's probably Chippewa, that, maybe we know more about their language than they know about our language. So it's you know, it was awesome that they were happy about, you know, including our language in their daycare. And we did the, like the powwow posters and the, like for the Munsee-Delaware Nation gathering, we translated them into the language. We had the, all of the history and language weekends. We translated all of those posters into the language also.
So it comes down to where history fits in with our language, and we have access to some stories from a century ago. We also have some built heritage and print resources. So the building that you see is the ancestral home of my family and Mary Jane's family and Julie's family, but it also actually has connections with Karen's family as well. In that this building was built in the 1840s, but within its walls was representative of the last place where you could hear Munsee language without the interference of English, but also the transference of learning a second language of English. So we do have a physical structure which supports our language work on a nearby park, but it provides that, I guess, what you could call the inspiration. Language work on our community, and again, this is done by a very small group, includes translating stories that are told by community members into the language. So translating that they were actually recorded first in English, but now they're translated in Munsee. So I share with you a small section of one that Karen and I are working on right now, which was the story was given to the London Free Press. I believe it's the Free Press in 1931, that details Jacob Logan, one of my relatives, talking about the story of Tecumseh. And that story would have happened in this building. So part of our work now is taking those historical stories and translating them back into the language and giving them some illustrations so that they're for use in the community, but also within the Ontario curriculum to support our students, whether they're from the K-12 or whether they're in university or college. Again, in a historical context, dialect and language tend to be intermixed, and within our own community, even though it's small, it has very unique. It has some unique. It has a unique history, as Mark mentioned, in terms of where it came from, and we have had community members who have translated books, the Anglican Book of Hymns, into the language, and it happened just very shortly after giving up those masks, that mask that you saw in the very early 1840s. So a man by the name of Charles Half Moon actually translated one of the books that was important to the Anglican Church into the Munsee language. These documents provide us a window into the ability to start to translate some of those old words that aren't found in our dictionaries, but also understand that within our very small community, there is a unique dialect, and it is unique in southwestern Ontario from Six Nations and from Moravian Town. And it's, acknowledging that, the dialect did exist, but also what words can we find? And I like to think back that our ancestors are giving us clues to solve, right? Where, things had to disappear for a while because of all that's happened here in Canada. But they give us the clues through history, through our song, through our art. There are the clues that we have to put back together in order to support the language, to support history, and to support culture.
I just wanted to mention that the hymn book on the left, I actually have an original copy of that that was given to me by my grandfather's sister, Mary Dawson. When she passed away, her son, Jim Dawson, he gave it to me because he said, I know you know the language, so you'll probably get more use out of this book than I will. So I have that, and it's in really, really good condition.
Thank you so much, Ian and Karen and Mary Jane and Keegai Peters for sharing your knowledge with us. Usually this would take about 2 days to do, and we've condensed it.